This video has been produced to provide information for the community on the update to land valuations in the Snowy Valleys Council area. Council doesn't have any input to this process, as land valuations are the responsibility of the New South Wales Valuer General, but councils must use these land valuations in determining the rates paid by landowners. So this video has been produced to help the community to understand the impacts the update will have on their rates. The first thing to note is that the updated valuations do not increase the total amount of rate revenues received by council. Increases in council revenues are restricted to the annual rate peg set by IPART, which this year is 2.6%. It is also important to note that this process is distinct from rates harmonisation, the process of achieving a fair distribution of the rating burden between the former Tumut and Tumbarumba Shire council areas, which is due to be undertaken in 2021. It's worth noting that the increase associated with these updated land valuations are in some cases actually far more significant than what people will face from rates harmonisation. This process is simply about the impacts that changes in the relative value of properties within each of the former council areas will have on the rates people pay. Putting it very simply, if the value of your land increases relative to the value of other land in the area, your rates will increase above the annual rate peg. But if the value of your land decreases relative to others, your rates are more likely to decrease. This chart shows the proportion of council's total $9.4 million in rates collected each year from the main land use categories. As can be seen, the majority comes from residential and farmland. The updated land valuations do not change either the size of the pie overall or the slice paid, for example, by farmers relative to business ratepayers. If we look specifically at residential land, which generates $3.6 million in rates, the updated valuations do not change the slice of the pie from each of the former council areas. This is frozen until rates are harmonised in 2021. Updated valuations only impact the amounts paid within each of the former council areas. So let's look at the specific impacts on residential ratepayers within the former Tumut Shire as an example of the issues that will apply across all rating categories. This chart shows the proportion of rates paid by landowners in each of the main towns and villages currently with the old valuations. The slice of the pie will go up or down depending on whether there has been a relative increase in land values in one town relative to another. This chart shows the relative changes in land value in each of the main towns and the former Tumut Shire in general. And if we use the former council area as a whole as a benchmark, we can see that increases in Tumut and Adelong are far lower than those in Batlow, Talbingo and other areas. But these relative increases do not translate directly into increases in rates in all cases. To understand the issues, we need to actually look at the land values, as this has an influence, particularly in the former Tumut Shire, due to the impact of the minimum rate. The additional chart at the bottom shows the updated median land values across the former Tumut Shire. This highlights that although the increases in land values at Batlow are significant, the actual land value and so the rates at Batlow are lower than most other towns. In fact, any increases in land values will generally not increase the rates over the rate peg, as the majority of properties fall below the threshold of about $62,000 for the $540 minimum rate. The increases in Talbingo, on the other hand, will have a direct impact on rates paid in the town because most land values are above the threshold for the minimum rate. Rates on residential land of median value in Talbingo were around $600 but will now increase to around $780 because of the higher land values. It's a strong argument to move to a base rate structure as is in place in the former Tumbarumba Shire. It's arguably fairer because it reduces the difference between rates paid on higher and lower valued properties. And that's something Council will be considering as part of the rates harmonisation process to be finalised next year. So these two charts show that while the total size of the pie, the total rate revenues from residential land in the former Tumut Shire, won't increase, the slices for particular towns do change. As discussed earlier, Batlow's slice doesn't really change despite the large increases in land values because they are generally below the threshold for the minimum rate. But the increases for Talbingo are far higher because the median land values are higher. And this largely matches an associated reduction in Tumut, where increases in land values were lower. But it's important to recognise that the actual increases for particular properties in Tumut vary considerably. The median or the middle range of increases was about 16%, but at the lower end, the increases are only around 5%, while increases at the top end were closer to 25%. The implications of these changes is best understood with an example. Take a property of median value in Tumut. The old valuation was $72,000 and the rates on that were $715 a year. If the value of that property only increased by 5% to $76,000, the new rates would be $665, a saving of about $50. But if the value increased by 20% to $86,000, the new rates would be $755, an increase of $40 a year. These examples of residential land in Batlow, Talmingo and Tumut highlight how difficult it is to make generalisations about the impacts of the new land valuations on individual ratepayers. Large increases in land values don't increase councils' rates overall, and they don't necessarily translate into large increases in rates where the minimum rate in Tumut applies. If we look now at residential properties in the former Tumbarumba Shire, the changes in rates here are far less significant than in the former Tumut Shire for two reasons. Firstly, the relative changes in land values are far less significant, but secondly, the former Tumbarumba Shire used a base rate that everyone pays instead of the minimum rate used in Tumut. This has the effect of flattening out the rating structure and reducing the difference between the rates paid on higher and lower valued properties. This issue will be discussed in detail in relation to rates harmonisation and a new rating structure for the entire Snowy Valleys Council next year. So, as can be seen in this chart, the overall increase in residential land values in the former Tumbarumba Shire was only about half that in the former Tumut Shire, but also the relative differences in the increases between towns was far less. Cancoban, Rosewood and the other localities all increased more than the Tumbarumba Township. But because the land values in these locations are lower than in Tumbarumba itself, their rates will still be lower. This means that the proportion of rates generated in each town has only changed slightly, with around $5,000 moving off Tumbarumba and onto Cancoban and Rosewood. There was also far less variations within the Tumbarumba Township itself than what we saw with Tumut. Over 80% of properties increased consistently by around 11%. So let's return to the overall rates collected for Snowy Valleys Council. As was noted earlier, the new land valuations don't change the slice of the pie for each of the main land use categories, which is important because the increases in land values between these are not at all consistent. As can be seen here, the median value of farmland has, on average, seen by far the biggest increase of all land use categories, with increases of 50% in Tumut and 40% in Tumbarumba. Increases in rural residential land were also higher than the average across all land uses, and this time Tumbarumba's were higher than Tumut's. Whereas business land has seen far smaller increases in both Tumut and Tumbarumba, and residential land in Tumbarumba particularly has seen smaller increases. But these changes in the relative values of land in different categories doesn't change the size of the slice each contributes to council's revenues overall. What this is doing, though, is changing the tax rate on land in different categories. For example, the tax rate on farmland is decreasing considerably because land values have increased, but the rates collected haven't increased. Changes in the proportion of rates levied on each category is something that will be considered as part of the new rating structure for the Snowy Valleys Council. For now, let's look at the changes to farmland rates associated with the new valuations. The proportion of farmland rates coming from the former Tumbarumba Shire is far larger than for the residential land. Again, the updated land values do not change the slice of the pie from each of the former council areas. That's frozen until rates are harmonised in 2021. Updated land valuations only impact the amounts paid within each of the former council areas. This chart shows the differences in the increases in farmland values in the former Tumut Shire. The key point to note is that even though the median or middle value increase was 50%, the impacts either side of this are markedly different. At the lower end, increases in farmland values are only 10 or 20%, while at the higher end, increases are getting up to 70, 80 or even 90% or more. This increase in land values directly translates into increases in rates. What it means is that an owner of a farm of median value under the old valuations, about $220,000, which attracted rates of around $1,170 a year, would see very different impacts on their rates depending on the increase with the new land valuations. If their increase in valuation fell in the lower quarter of all properties, say a 10% increase to $242,000, then they would see a reduction in their rates of over $300 per year. But if the increase in their land value was at the higher end, say 60%, bringing the land up to $350,000, then they would see an increase of around $76 per year in their rates. Unfortunately, it isn't possible to clearly differentiate the localities where valuations increased more or less than the rest. The key point here is that the variations in land values across the former Tumut Shire are significant, and so too will be the changes in rates. As with the sharp increase in residential rates in Talbingo, the only option Council has to reduce the gap between the rates paid on higher and lower valued properties is to introduce a base rate, such as is in place in the former Tumbarumba Shire currently. Again, this is something that Council will be considering as part of the new rating structure to be adopted for the whole of Snowy Valleys next year. So let's look at farmland in the former Tumbarumba Shire. When this is overlaid, it is clear that the differences between the increases across the board are less than those in the former Tumut Shire. In the middle of all properties, the increase is more like 40% than 50% as it was in Tumut. At the lower end, the minimum increases are more like 30%, so higher than Tumut. While at the higher end, increases are still around 60 to 70%. So if we again consider the impacts on a farm of median value, which for Tumbarumba is a farm with the land valued at around $230,000, attracting rates of around $1,095 a year. At the lower end of the increases, say 25%, would bring the value of the property up to $288,000 and result in a saving of $145 per year in rates. While at the higher end, increases are still around 60 to 70%. That would bring the land value up to around $380,000 and result in a rate increase of around $50 per year. As with Tumut, it's not possible to provide a clear list of localities with higher or lower increases. Changes in valuations differ significantly and really need to be considered on an individual farmland basis. What this analysis has tried to highlight is that there is a wide range of impacts, both positive and negative, on individual farmland ratepayers. Again, these changes in rates do not change the size of the pie. So let's look next at the business land use category. Like residential, but unlike farmland, the majority of rate revenues comes from the former Tumut Shire, and the increases are lower than those for farmland and rural residential. The increases in particular towns and villages are also similar to those for residential land, the largest in Tumut Shire being in Batlow and Talbingo. But again, the increases in percentage terms in land values need to be considered in the context of the actual land values, which vary considerably between towns. As with residential land, the increase in values in Batlow will often not result in increases in rates because over half of the properties fall below the threshold, now around $39,000, where the minimum rate applies. But increases in Talbingo particularly will result in increases in rates. A property of median value, previously $70,000, attracted rates of $1,100 a year. But now the median value is increased to $105,000, the rates payable will be $1,450, an extra $350 a year. As discussed in relation to residential land, the only way to reduce these impacts would be to introduce a base charge to reduce the difference between rates paid on higher and lower valued properties. There is far less variation in increases in land in Tumut Township than there was in residential land. Increases are fairly consistent at around 10%, so in general there should be some savings. Businesses in Adelong should generally see savings too, given the minimal increases in property values relative to other towns. Moving on to the former Tumbarumba Shire, there is a relative increase in the value of business land in towns other than Tumbarumba, which will lead to a corresponding increase in rates. but the actual land value in these other towns and villages is generally lower than in Tumbarumba, so the actual rates paid on these properties will still be lower. Moving on to the final major land use category, rural residential land, there is a considerable range of increases across both former council areas. In Tumut, the increases start at only 5% at the lower end, climbing to 30% at the high end. This change in relative values will result in a corresponding shift in rates. When the changes in rates in Tumut are put alongside those in Tumbarumba, in red, it is clear that while increases for the median or middle values are similar at around 25%, there is a more consistent increase in values even at the lower end. But there is also a far larger increase in the higher end of values, which will result in larger increases in rates for these properties. However, the impact of these increases will be lessened by the fact that the former Tumbarumba Shire utilised a base rate for rural residential land that reduces the difference in rates paid on higher and lower valued land. And that concludes the analysis of the impacts of the new land valuations across Snowy Valleys Council. So, where to from here? The New South Wales Valuer General has advised Council they will be mailing out the new land valuations to all landowners in April. Landowners will have 60 days to lodge an objection to the valuation, and the details of the process for doing so will be included in the information being sent out. Further information is also available on the Valuer General's website at the link shown on the screen. Council must now use these new valuations to calculate the rates on all properties in Snowy Valleys Council for the 2021 financial year. Rate notices will be mailed out in July and include details of the new rates to be levied on each property based on the updated valuations. Council is also engaging the community separately about a new rating structure for the entire local government area. Council must adopt this at the end of the rate freeze period in 2021. I'd encourage everyone in the community to participate in this process that aims to develop a new, fairer rating structure for the entire local government area. There are a number of videos and detailed option studies available at the Your Voice Snowy Valleys Council website at the link shown on your screen. And that also includes a survey where you can let Council know what you think the fairest options are moving forward.